Hard to believe that those two are the same composer. You notice how in the second piece, again, the emphasis is on clarity of the text. The choir is singing the same thing at the same time so that the congregation can understand the words. This was, of course, before Xerox machines made it quite easy to give everyone in the congregation a translation or text of music. Now, a slightly younger generation of English composers, and probably the greatest of his generation, was William Byrd. William Byrd was in a difficult position as someone whose private religious loyalties were always to Roman Catholicism, but who had to work as a musician for the Protestant Elizabeth. As Robert Quinney writes in the notes to this wonderful CD, which seems almost to have been made with this tonight's talk in mind, Mary and Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey. This is, of course, the Westminster Abbey Choir singing. Robert Quinney writes, "He was both courtier and conspirator, a pillar of the establishment and an illegal. Seems to have regarded the provision of music for the Church of England as a challenge to be relished. In the mellifluous full anthem, O Lord, make thy servant Elizabeth. It is tempting to hear actual personal warmth in the music. Or is that Elizabethan propaganda, still working after 4 centuries? So here we have a Catholic composer writing a very overt tribute to a very Protestant queen. Elizabeth's reign and the relative stability made possible what we might call the first golden age of Anglican choral music. As we'll see tonight, there are 3 really quite distinct golden ages, and this was the first. Another composer of this time period, who I'm not going to play tonight, but I couldn't resist including this anecdote, Thomas Wilkes, who lived from 1573 to 1623. We think of sacred choral music as this very angelic sort of thing. But Wilkes was not that kind of guy at all. In fact, he was dismissed from Chichester Cathedral for being drunk at the organ and using bad language during services. So, some things perhaps really haven't changed. Elizabeth I died in 1603 without ever having really left clear instructions as to who should succeed her. However, because there wasn't really anyone else, her distant relative, the young King of Scotland, James VI, traveled south, promptly lost all interest in Scotland, and became King James I of England. Westminster Abbey has put out this wonderful companion to the previous CD, it just came out this year, Music from the Reign of King James I. A prominent composer of this time was the wonderful Thomas Tomkins. Tomkins lived from a very long time, 1572 to 1656, 84 years. As we'll see later, he might have wished that he hadn't lived so long. But as a young man, Tomkins was organist at the Chapel Royal. And one of his duties was to write music for royal occasions. And I have from this James I CD examples of 3 very different kinds of royal occasions spanning the complete spectrum of human emotion. The first piece, Be Strong and of a Good Courage, was written for the coronation of James I in 1603. We're going to talk about a lot of coronations tonight. This is the first one. So Thomas Tomkins, Be Strong and of a Good Courage. One thing you can notice in this piece is that, well, of course it's still in English, and clarity is still important. By this time, in the early 17th century, composers had a little more freedom to let different sections of the choir come in at different times. It wasn't so much everyone has to sing the same words at once. They were a little more relaxed about that. The Stuart monarchs were adherents of what would eventually become known as High Anglicanism, which means that they believed very much in the use of beauty in worship. They believed that the Church of England was not a new religion, but the Catholic continuation of the ancient Church of England, separated from Rome. They did not want to go back to Rome, but they also did not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. That was the dominant tendency during the Stuart kings, which, as we'll see, did not last. Now, this is an anthem for a happy occasion, but composers also had to write pieces for very sad occasions. In 1612, James's eldest son and heir, Prince Henry, died very unexpectedly at the age of 18. Henry was probably one of the most popular heirs to the throne in English history. He was everything a prince was supposed to be. He was charming, athletic, good-looking, intelligent, spoke several languages. Everyone loved him. So when he died, it was a real blow. And as a response to that, Tompkins wrote this heart-rending piece, When David Heard, using as its inspiration the story from the Bible of the death of King Solomon's son. Very different mood here. You can see how the music reflects the pain that the king must have felt at the loss of his son, just like King Solomon so many centuries earlier. Fortunately, in 1619, when the king himself came down with an illness, he recovered. And another composer, Orlando Gibbons, had the task of celebrating this recovery. Now, even for a die-hard royalist like myself, the flattery in this text might be considered a bit much. The piece is called "Oh, All True Faithful Hearts," and it includes the wonderful line, "His life is worth 10,000, therefore give each soul 10,000 thanks that he doth live." There's some wonderful solo writing in this piece. Since this is a recent recording, the boy treble soloist in this piece is the same soloist who we will hear at the end of a much more recent royal event. Oh. That's Thomas Featherstone, the treble soloist. We'll hear more from him later. It's a wonderful English name there. Now, With the death of James I in 1625, we enter into the darkest time of the history of both the monarchy and the choral tradition. James I was succeeded, his eldest son having died, by his second son, Charles I. Charles had all of his father's belief in the divine right of kings, with none of his cleverness at negotiating with Parliament. Charles, even more so than his father, believed very much in this Catholic high church interpretation of Anglicanism that I mentioned earlier. He was aided in this by his Archbishop, William Laud, one of my favorite archbishops, but many people in England at the time did not share that opinion. The English church had to deal at the time with an increasingly noisy and troublesome sect known as the Puritans. Now, you're getting very objective and neutral history tonight. The Puritans...
Exactly.
The Puritans hated everything that they thought was reminiscent of Roman Catholicism. The word puritanical today is often used to refer to someone who disapproves of some things like alcohol and tobacco. Actually, that's kind of misleading, because the real Puritans had no problem with alcohol. What they had a problem with was man-made beauty, especially in worship. Puritans wanted churches to be as plain as possible. They held fervently that worship should appeal only to the intellect and not at all to the senses. There were actually speeches in Parliament against what they called the squawking of choirs. They hated choirs in churches. They hated organ music in churches, believing, as they did, that the only music in churches should be a cappella congregational psalm singing. Now, I see that Keith Franks is here, and Keith always teaches his students to hiss at the name of Oliver Cromwell. So that's a welcome contribution tonight. A member of Parliament by the name of Oliver Cromwell became the military leader of the Puritans. It became a military conflict, partly because of these religious issues. I think that modern secular historians who like to see the Civil War as simply a conflict between the divine right of kings on the one hand and parliamentary democracy and liberty and all those other things that modern people are supposed to love on the other hand. But it was more complicated than that, because these religious disputes, which may baffle a lot of modern people, were extremely important to both sides at the time. One of the churches I visited in England last summer had an example of a beautiful ornately carved baptismal font that dated from the time of King Charles and Archbishop Laud. The Puritans were appalled by this. For his part, Archbishop Laud, not being a modern person believing in freedom of speech and freedom of the religion, when people disagreed with them, he tended to have them put in jail, which for some reason they didn't like very much. Charles wanted one liturgy for all of Britain. He wanted Scotland to have the same liturgy as the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer. When he tried to impose that on Scotland, and also a hierarchical structure of bishops, a war broke out, and Charles did not have the money for this war. In order to have money, raise money, he needed to finally summon a parliament after doing without it with 11 years. Charles really didn't like parliaments very much. But the king and parliament proved unable to resolve their differences, and it developed in a full-scale war, which raged off and on for 7 years. The Puritans won, and in 1649, in my opinion, the very darkest day of British history, murdered their king, Charles I. This was unprecedented. Other kings had, of course, been assassinated by their enemies, but for the de facto government to attempt to bring the king to trial and execute him as king had never happened before in the history of the world. This had profound implications for church music as well, because with the Puritans in trouble, the churches in power, the churches fell silent for 11 years. There was no organ music, no choral music in the cathedrals and churches of England. They actually violently destroyed organs. For example, at Worcester Cathedral, where I'm going this summer,